Good evening, everyone. We are excited to welcome you this evening to our third session in our Civilian Oversight Webinar Series. My name is Denise Molina Capers. I am the Director of the Racial and Social Justice Department for the City of Somerville. Tonight, we have ASL interpretation and CART services will be available during this live meeting. Please be aware that this meeting is also being recorded. The first session in the webinar series laid the foundation for the different types of civilian oversight models. We called it Civilian Oversight 101. The second session was a Q&A discussion with Cameron McKilney from the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, also known as NACOL. The goal of the session here tonight is to learn about the current procedures and incident reporting processes for filing a complaint or incident report with the Somerville Police Department. Before I introduce our panelists for tonight, I would like to provide a few community norms to help guide this meeting. Our constituents and community members will be able to ask questions and share their thoughts at some point in this webinar. And so we ask that you please speak your truth and use I statements. Respect everyone's opinions, listen with an open mind and heart, and expect and accept non-closure. When we open the floor for questions and comments, please use the Q&A feature to ask a question of the panelists. We will monitor the questions received and pose them to our panelists. I want to thank you for listening tonight, and we will help facilitate a panel discussion and community Q&A with the members from the Somerville Police Department around the current procedures and processes for filing a complaint or an incident report with SPD. So without delaying any further, I would like to introduce Somerville Police Chief Charles Femino and Lieutenant Michael Perot.
Denise, we're going to take it from here.
Yes, Chief.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Charlie Femino. I'm currently serving in the capacity of acting police chief for the City of Somerville and have been since the fall of 2020. As you probably are aware, they will be starting a process for a permanent police chief. It's already started, and but until then, I will be serving in this capacity. For those of you who don't know me, I served on the Somerville Police Department for almost 32 years before retiring in 2015. And I was called by the former mayoral administration to come back in 2020 to serve in this capacity until a new police is found. With me tonight is Lieutenant Mike Perone. Lieutenant Mike Perone is a 13-year veteran of the Somerville Police Department who rose through the ranks, currently a lieutenant, and serves as our primary investigator for the Office of Professional Standards, which investigates complaints, whether it be against the police department or individual officers, as he will explain during this presentation. We're going to start by talking about a complaint itself. Just as an introduction, the citizens of Somerville have the ability to submit a complaint to the Somerville Police Department, as well as to other city departments or to the state agencies verbally, in writing. There's an anonymous tip line that they can use if they don't wish to leave their name and want to just leave a description of a complaint itself. And then we also have internal complaints that are filed by whether it's officers of the same rank or superior officers, peers, or their superiors. And those investigations are reviewed and handled promptly as you will hear and described in the upcoming slides. Lieutenant Perone?
Thank you for being here tonight, everybody. As Chief Emino mentioned, my name is Mike Perone. I head up the Professional Standards Unit. I'm the primary investigator for complaints that do come through the Office of Professional Standards. So when a complaint is assigned to the Office of Professional Standards for investigation, a thorough investigation is conducted by us. I was an investigator for many years on the criminal side, and I can tell you that these investigations, just as much time and effort, if not more in some cases, goes into many of these internal investigations. Every investigation is different. Some are quite a bit more high profile than others, but all are treated the same way. For more high profile investigations, the Chief of Police often requests routine updates about the investigation, and I generally provide those on a weekly basis for those types of matters. When I do an investigation and I examine the evidence involved in a case, I generate a findings report and I submit that to the Chief of Police after all the evidence has been evaluated. This allows the chief to make an informed decision on any disciplinary matters after the investigation is completed. In terms of objectivity, professional standards investigations are conducted to determine if an employee has violated Massachusetts general laws, Somerville Police Department policies, rules and regulations of the Somerville Police Departments, and department procedures. Investigative findings can only be sustained if a preponderance of the evidence shows that an officer violated one of these specific principles. A preponderance of evidence is the standard that we go by when trying to determine if an officer did violate one of these principles. That is a lesser standard than what we would see in criminal courts, where we try to obtain proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The reason why that is because these are administrative investigations that determine job ramifications as opposed to other criminal penalties that could be imposed. In terms of established minimum standards, there is state law that determines minimum standards for investigations that we have to follow, and those guide our investigations, especially in terms of oversight through the post commission that we'll discuss later. All evidence that I find is documented in a findings report, as I had mentioned previously, along with a written analysis to show whether an employee has committed a violation for which they could face a potential penalty. This often comes in form and something that looks somewhere along the lines of a legal brief. It's an official document that will remain with the employee's file for the duration of their career. A sustained finding cannot be reached if the evidence doesn't conclusively show that a violation occurred.
I just want a couple of comments on the last two slides. One of the things that was mentioned is that we look at violations of policy. And so one might ask, who creates the policy? Are they subjective in nature? What standards do they have to meet? To be clear, all of our departmental policies meet a state accreditation process, which means which is in and of itself another commission of a sort that will deem whether or not there are standards met by the police department. The policies have to meet best practices according to the Massachusetts Police Accreditation process. Our police department was first accredited in 2019, which means we met about 257 standards that are best practices in the industry of policing. We just recently, I believe in the spring of 2021, received our first reaccreditation. The reaccreditation process takes, the reaccreditation committee comes in, auditors come in for 3 days, and they review all of our policies, procedures to make sure that the standards set forth by the Massachusetts Accreditation Commission are met. So when we say whether an officer violated a policy, I want you to realize that there are standards that are met at the state level as to compare them to the best practices. But once Lieutenant Perone conducts his investigation and he then submits that report to me, he has to justify what actions he took, what he investigated. It may require further investigation. There's a determination made based on the appropriate level of discipline for the particular findings of sustained. So in other words, if an officer is alleged to have violated a mass general law or policy or procedure, we look at that, and then we look at what level of discipline would be appropriate. And the officers provided a copy of those reports. He or she has certain appeal rights, but we then look at whether or not that complaint is, it deems the level of discipline based on what we call progressive discipline. So if it's a first-time offense and it's not a major or egregious incident, we may issue the range from oral reprimand all the way up to a recommendation for termination. But the reporting party themselves are notified of the investigative findings in writing, and a copy of those findings in the disposition letter are placed in that employee's file, where it remains for the duration of the employee's career, and it's considered in future cases of any discipline and also future employment opportunities. For example, if that officer is proceeding into a promotional process, that's reviewed by the department itself, as well as the interview panel that interviews that officer. And in addition to that, when it comes to confirmation, the city council itself reviews the disciplinary file of every officer who may be going up for a promotion and decides whether or not to confirm that officer for promotion. Next slide.
The Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, otherwise known as POST, was established in 2020 with a mission to improve police transparency and accountability. This was done, obviously, the events over the last several years to try to gain better trust and legitimacy within the communities throughout the state, including here in Somerville. POST is responsible for mandatory certification, for overseeing the disciplinary process, and for the training of all police officers in the Commonwealth. Officers must maintain this certification in order to work as police officers here in Massachusetts. Without the certification, you are unable to work as a police officer. If you lose your certification at any point while employed as a police officer, you will be separated from service as a police officer.
If I could interject, Lieutenant.
Sure.
One of the things that I want the listeners to realize is that this is the first time that in Massachusetts, in the Commonwealth, that there's a civilian oversight of police officers at the state level, and that their officers just don't go along their career, receive discipline, and continue working. There is strict review processes by the Post Commission to whether or not that officer can remain certified as a police officer. And as a recent, and again, the Post Commission is newly created, so they're still in the process of creating their investigatory reviews. But there's already been a list established. All of what the Post Commission does is public record. There's already been a number of police officers in the Commonwealth who have been decertified or have not received a recertification to date. So I just want to bring that out to your attention before we move on to from this slide. Go ahead.
And there is a strict process that we have to adhere to with the Post Commission. Any types of complaints that, whether internal or external, that Post deems not to be minor in nature, we're required to submit those to the commission so they can begin overseeing the investigation within 48 hours of receipt. The only types of complaints that they're not concerned with are cases of rudeness, tardiness. If an officer had some type of equipment violation, those generally are handled internally. But for anything else, they oversee that process. Post commission reviews all complaints, investigations, and dispositions in any matter that they don't deem to be minor. They can take action on these if they feel that the police department in some way should have taken stronger action. The commission may, can we actually have the last slide again? The commission may take additional action against an employee, such as suspending or revoking their police certification. They actually track and try to keep up with any employee who tries to leave one department to go to another. So if an employee resigns or retires during an investigation that may not have a favorable finding to them, Post still requires us to do an investigation, submit a findings report, and requires the chief to recommend some type of discipline for that employee. So that is on file if they do seek employee somewhere else and try to gain recertification with another department. All of that will still be considered. All information related to employee investigations and discipline is maintained in a centralized database with Post to ensure that past discipline is considered in events involving past employees and present. Individuals may file complaints with the Post Commission directly.
Lieutenant, you might want to just slow down a bit because I didn't realize and I forgot that we were actually interpreting. So I think we both should slow down a little bit because I didn't realize that myself.
Sure. Individuals may file a complaint with the Post Commission directly. This means if they are not comfortable coming to the police department, they do have that option to go to the commission. The commission does have investigators where they do have investigators that can launch an investigation into employee conduct. They also have the ability to keep a closer eye on the investigations that we're doing at the request of citizens. Post can actually decertify an entire police department. If there is something a police department is doing that is not above board, Post can go in and decertify the department and every officer in the department if they choose to do so.
So what factors in determining discipline? Once again, when the lieutenant completes his investigations, and depending on the type of investigation, this could take, several days, several weeks, and in some cases, several months. But at the end of it all, and when it's turned into the office of the chief of police, who ultimately discusses, reviews, and meets discipline, the types of factors that I consider are the severity of the offense, if whether or not the offense is minor in nature, whether it's criminal in nature, whether someone's civil rights had been violated, excessive use of force violations are taken a lot more seriously. In some cases, it may lead to a termination process. But we also take into consideration the employee's disciplinary history. Again, if it's not an egregious violation that is not a violation of civil rights, if it's not the use of excessive force, but it's still a policy violation, we look at the employee's disciplinary history. If he or she has no past history, and it certainly is considered when the level of discipline is administered. And we also look at the impact on the community. As we know, we have moved into an era of reimagining public safety. We are looking to an era where there's more scrutiny on police action, and we at SPD, along with the Director of Racial and Social Justice, Denise Molina-Capers, are seeking to move forward in building and establishing trust and legitimacy within the community. So we know whatever actions we take, depending on the severity of the incident and the officer's history, that we will be scrutinized as to what discipline is administered. So we take all of that into consideration. Next slide.
There are certain circumstances with the existence of the Post Commission where it's basically out of the police department's hands if there are certain acts of misconduct that occur. I listed some of the examples here: being convicted of a felony, if you obtained a certification through fraud or misrepresenting yourself, if your certification was revoked in another jurisdiction, if you filed a false police report while on the job, if you tampered with a record during official proceedings, if you engaged in intimidation of a witness, engaged in conduct that would constitute a hate crime, if you use a chokehold, excessive force of certain kinds that cause serious injury or death, failed to intervene to prevent another officer from engaging in prohibited conduct, if you intentionally obtained a false confession, made a false arrest, or falsified evidence in some way, or if there was some other reason you were not fit for duty and dangerous to the public, all of these would cause you to be decertified by post, meaning that you would have to be separated from service. And that's a decision that they make through their oversight.
But in addition to that, if before we leave that slide, if at the disciplinary process, by state statute and by state statute, I am authorized to administer up to 5 days of discipline suspension, with the incident being forwarded with the recommendation from me, the chief of police, to the mayor, to the appointing authority for additional discipline, up to and including termination. So if I administer 5 days, for example, on something that I feel an officer committed a violation of a policy, a procedure, committed some type of egregious conduct, I would recommend 5 days suspension without pay, and then that would be forwarded in a letter and a communication from me to the mayor, the appointing authority, with the request for additional discipline. Now that discipline can range from 6 days of discipline up to and including termination. And in many cases, when it reaches to that level of discipline, there's usually a request for them to, the appointing authority to review it for additional discipline up to and including that termination of the officer. And that's happened in several frequent cases. Frequently, it happens in many cases, I should say.
Chief, I wanna take a moment really quickly to see if anyone from the community has a question based on what you and Lieutenant have shared so far. I know that we did have a question about where can someone, where the link to submit complaints is. And so our RSJ coordinator, Amanda Najam Williams, will be putting the link in the chat, but I want to give an opportunity for our community members to ask any further questions if they have any right now.
Denise, on the first part of the presentation?
I'm sorry?
You mean on what we've presented?
On the first part of the presentation, yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Denise, I just want to mention one thing with regards to the complaint form as well. So we have made efforts to offer the complaint form obviously online, and you can file one in person. We offer the form in Spanish currently, and we're attempting to get it online live in the near future in Portuguese as well. And we're going to continue to update those forms in different languages so they're available to a broader range of the public.
Thank you, Lieutenant. There was a second question that says, do you also have the link to submit complaints to post?
I don't personally have it right now in front of me. I'm not sure if Lieutenant Perron would have that either. You can submit a complaint directly to post. If we don't have that readily available, we'll make sure that we get that to you, and so that you could send it out.
It is on the mass.gov website.
Okay.
Thank you. And so we are going to give a moment for another question if there is one, and if not, we can continue for a few more minutes on the presentation. All right, seeing none. I'll give you back the floor, Lieutenant in Chief. And I see that Amanda has posted the link for filing a complaint with Post for the constituent who asked that question.
So when it comes to decertification or suspension of a certification, Post has an option to suspend if or decertify if an officer is convicted of a misdemeanor, if there was some type of bias-based activity or interaction, and that's what the allegation is. They could suspend or terminate by the appointing agency for disciplinary reasons. And if there's repeated and substantial internal affairs complaints, they can also suspend or decertify for that. What they actually do, and again, I'll reiterate what I said earlier, the Post Commission is fairly new, and it was established in 2020, but it really has been an ongoing process, even to this day, as to the protocols that they're using in a lot of different areas, including discipline. Every 3 years, every police officer in the Commonwealth must undergo a recertification process, and that's processed by the last name, the alphabet by their last name. So right now they've completed the decertify or recertify process for A through H. The next phase will come from H through another letter in the alphabet and so on. But every 3 years that repeats as a process. Anytime within that 3 years, if an officer commits a violation that goes to the Post that's egregious in nature, that they feel fits into the category of decertification, they can decertify them at any time. And so this is a process that the Post Commission initially reviews and then renders a decision. And then the officer obviously will have a right of appeal with the Post Commission. And ultimately that is put into a centralized database. And so that, as Lieutenant Perrone explained earlier, if that officer leaves, for instance, Somerville Police Department and tries to get a job in another state, that centralized database is available for an agency to look at and consider when hiring an officer. The goal of that system is that agencies will have a better ability to hire qualified police officers who do not have a history of disciplinary action.
And if I could just add, when we do hire new police officers, what you mentioned in terms of this database, it's called the National Decertification Database. In the Commonwealth, all police departments hiring new employees are required. That is a requirement to check that and ensure that they weren't placed on in that National Decertification Database anywhere else in the Commonwealth or in other states. There are many other states who have similar options to the Post Commission. In terms of transparency, all professional standards investigations are a public record, and they can be obtained by simply filing a public records request with the City of Somerville. Some information in these records may be redacted, but generally that revolves around medical information and things like that. We do see that sometimes in the investigations that we do. We actually had a recent development with the Post Commission. They are attempting to establish an online database of any sustained complaint against any member of any department within the Commonwealth. So just yesterday, I had to submit information about any sustained complaint that any active or special police officer or officer who transferred, any type of sustained complaint that they may have in their history. I believe that database will be coming online within the next month or so.
Lieutenant, can you estimate how many records you had to compile and send over?
If I remember correctly, it was 43 or 44.
Okay.
In terms of annual statistics, I did provide the last 2 years. As you can see, in 2021, we had 7 external complaints, meaning these came in from members of the public. 3 internal complaints, which were either peer or supervisors who uncovered issues of misconduct that we investigated here in the Office of Professional Standards. Of those total of 10 complaints, 3 were sustained. In 2022, we did have 9 external complaints. 4 of these external complaints were actually investigated by an independent investigator hired by the city. All 4 of those instances, the officer was actually exonerated in those cases. There were 8 internal complaints, and out of the total of 17 complaints that we received, 8 in total in 2022 were sustained, which was 47% of the complaints that we received.
Yeah, I'd like to just interject. When the viewers look at the slide, it only captures the actual complaints filed. But keep in mind, or I'd like you to keep in mind at least, that this is based on over 20,000 calls for service a year, and probably over 40,000 citizen interactions in the course of a year. And so when you look at the number of complaints filed, whether they be external or internal, I just want you to keep in mind that the volume of citizen interaction is well over 40,000 interactions a year with citizens. And so I think that we're trying, from the PD's experience, we're trying to capture, what data we have available. And these are the complaints that came in. These are the complaints that we investigated, and these are the findings that we made on that number of complaints.
Chief, I want to chime in here. We have questions coming in. If you can clarify, we have about 3 questions. The first one is, if you can clarify what sustained means.
Yep. Go ahead. Do you want me to take each one separately?
Yeah, if you can answer that one first, and then I'll share with you the other 2 questions.
Yeah. After Lieutenant Perone conducts an investigation, and if there's a violation, again, with the different categories, if it's a criminal violation of a criminal law, if it's a policy or a rule and regulation violation, if we find that there's by preponderance of evidence that the officer is responsible for conducting that allegation, that's what sustained means, that the officer is found to have committed or is responsible for what is alleged to have happened.
So following that, now that there's clarification on what sustained means, the next question is from Ryan, and he's asking, is a sustained complaint one that might have legitimacy?
Well, all complaints, in my opinion, have legitimacy. I don't think that someone would submit a complaint unless they felt that it wasn't a legitimate complaint. So in my opinion, any complaint that's filed has legitimacy, and that's why we try to, that's why that we if there's a complaint filed, unless it's something that the post is telling us is minor in nature, as Lieutenant Perone previously described, we investigate by policy all complaints that are filed, and we provide a findings for that particular complaint. Again, if it's a minor complaint, then that's handled after a review, and if it comes within the scope of a considered minor complaint, that complaint is still reviewed, and it goes back to the captain or the supervisor of the particular officer, and that might result in the officer having some type of a counseling session, an oral counseling session. It also might result in, a lot of times, if it's a minor violation, it might necessitate the officer going to additional remedial training in the subject. For instance, if there was a report that the officer was rude, we might send that officer to a de-escalation or dealing with the youth or dealing with the public type of a training. So, we have, keep in mind that the allegation of a complaint, the end result is not meant to be punitive in nature, but to be able to recognize and to change behavior that's not acceptable. So in minor instances, it might be reviewed by a supervisor or a captain of that particular officer's block of work where he's assigned or she's assigned, but it still results in some type of remedial training or counseling session, so that we can try to change the behavior of that officer, that they recognize what was how they may have been perceived to have deviated from the norm.
Thank you, Chief. And the last question we have is, does SPD have metrics on how long it has taken historically to respond to close complaint cases or reach the sustained status?
Could you just repeat the question one more time, please?
Sure. And I'll also put it in the chat if that's helpful. The question is, does SPD have metrics on how long it has taken historically to respond to / close complaints cases or reach the sustained status?
Okay, I'm going to initially answer, but I also have Lieutenant Perone. So I have, in the 2.5 years that I have returned to SPD, I've seen complaints be resolved in a day. I've seen them resolved in a week, but I've also seen complaints, depending on the severity, take several months to investigate. Those types of investigations at the higher level could net probably 40 plus pages of investigatory work on the part of Lieutenant Perone and those who are assisting him in that investigation. So it's a legal analysis that's prepared with the findings, and it takes time. And to be thorough, we also have to be mindful of not only constitutional rights of the officer, but also of collective bargaining issues within the office's collective bargaining, their union rights. So all of that put together could take, depending on the type of complaint, anywhere from a day to months. Mm-hmm. And I'll let Lieutenant Perone add to that if you'd like.
Yes. So obviously not all complaints are created equally. Not all investigations are equally, right? Are equal. So I can tell you I've had investigations in the past where I've had to examine hours and hours of video and go through them frame by frame, interview several members of the community, several officers, anybody who may have witnessed whatever incident it may be that I'm investigating. If there is a lot of that, obviously can take a great deal of time. Also, it's dependent on how many open cases there are, because you have to work on them simultaneously. What I can tell you is with the Post Commission, there is a guideline. They do like to see us do them within 90 days if possible. If not, we have to inform them that they're not complete and give them a reason why. 1 year is when they do require us to close out a case. In matters where that potentially could be criminal, this can be complicated, and there is some leeway there, I believe, with Post, where we can get special permission from them to extend it if necessary. But generally 90 days, no longer than a year, is the standard.
And if I may just add one last comment, Lieutenant Perone mentioned criminal. So we have to keep in mind that if it's a criminal violation, the officer is being charged criminally, the district attorney's office also gets involved in the court system. And so a lot of time, well, not a lot of times, but if it's a case of that nature, we have to run an internal and administrative investigation parallel with the district attorney's office, and in some cases, wait for the findings of the criminal investigation in order to render administrative discipline. In some cases, it's the opposite. In some cases, an officer may be terminated before the criminal case is actually heard and a decision is made. It depends. It's a case-by-case basis, and we collaborate with the district attorney's office in those types of investigations to decide what, in the public's interest, in the prosecution of a case, what's the best route to take. And we make a decision between us in a collaborative way so that we don't jeopardize one or the other.
And I can say, just to expound upon that a little bit, I do communicate with our partners at the district attorney's office about what types of evidence that they would want to introduce in some type of prosecution. And if me interviewing somebody would interfere with that in any way, because they have certain constitutional rights that they're afforded in a criminal proceeding where they're not as stringent on the administrative side. So we do collaborate with them quite frequently when we have instances like that.
Chief, we have another, and Lieutenant, we have another question. Has SPD ever been in violation of professional standards for investigatory conduct?
Are you referring to the department as a whole?
I'll post the question in the chat, and to our constituent, are you referring to the department as a whole?
In other words, what my question is the listener asking whether the department itself has ever been in violation of some type of an investigatory process? Is that I believe the question?
Yes, the constituent is saying yes, correct.
Okay, so to the best of my knowledge, again, I've been back with SPD since the fall of 2020. Lieutenant Perrone, you can add to this, but I don't believe that there's ever been a findings that I know of that SPD has committed a violation itself. Lieutenant?
So I'm just trying to understand the question. So there have been instances where, you know, it's not quite clear who we may have something that may have occurred, and there may be evidence that a member of the department may have committed some kind of a violation. It's not always that easy to determine who the officer was, but to maintain our trust and legitimacy within the community, we do want to recognize if we uncover evidence that there was misconduct on the part of a department member that we may not be able to identify. And we have sustained findings against the department in the past, just to, you know, make sure that a complaint lodged by somebody is recognized.
So just so that I can elaborate, I mean, one of the things that I hear here, you know, as we speak about this particular topic, so if the department itself, not the officer, lieutenant, the department itself, in some cases, if during an investigation of an allegation of misconduct of an officer, we find there wasn't actually a violation, because that's what we have to go by. Was there a violation of a policy, procedure, or rule or regulation that's in writing that this officer was supposed to adhere to? If we find in some cases that the officer may not have violated a policy, procedure, or rule or regulation because there's not one that exists that covers the particular allegation, we call that a policy failure. And in that case, we do a review of the existing policy, and we revise that policy to basically bring it up to a standard where if it happened again in the future, there would be a clear-cut violation. Am I explaining that correctly, Lieutenant?
Yes.
Policy violation?
Policy failures, yep. Yes, you have. Okay.
All right, there are currently no more questions on the floor, so we can continue. And if there's another question posed, I will ask. Chief and Lieutenant, you're free to continue with your presentation.
So in reference to community feedback, I think it's important, you know, to realize that unlike years past, I mean, the department itself is attempting to work with the Department of Racial and Social Justice specifically, but to open dialogue with the community. You know, myself and the director have had a number of public meetings. We've had a number of private meetings by way of email and in personal conversations over the phone. We've had dialogue with the community. We have had over the last, since the Director of Racial and Social Justice, Delise Molina Capus, have come on board in February or March of 2021. We have had dialogue sessions ranging from open forums to coffee with the chief. And it's all for trying to hear what you, the community, want for policing in Somerville, but to have some type of feedback of what's been happening, what your complaints might be, so that we can make our process a better process within the police department. And many suggestions have come forward by the public. We now have an easier reporting line, online system. We've updated our complaint forms so that there's various languages. And we're also in early spring of 2022, we started to revise our SPD police website to include crime data and incident data that had not been put on that website for many years, so that the community itself could see not only what's happening in Somerville by way of incidents and crime, but we also put other information on there. And we're in the process, by way of the City Council accepting a proposal in last year's budget to revise our website either further in collaboration with the Director of Racial and Social Justice and her department, so that we have a more open and transparent website, so that information can flow back and forth, not only from the police department to the public, but from the public to the police department.
We have another question. The constituent is stating they often see police cruisers parked on sidewalks, blocking crosswalks or bike lanes throughout Somerville. And they're wondering if SPD considers illegal parking offenses viable to submit via the complaint form.
Okay, so I'll try to answer that, and I'll defer to Lieutenant Perron also. So complaints like that are not considered major complaints that would be filed with post, but there's certainly deviations from professional conduct and looked at as such. So if a complaint comes in like that, and they do, we look at the merit of the complaint and what possible reasons for what was happening and what the allegation was, and we take that into consideration. But in every one of those cases, I will tell you that the officer is contacted and is either brought up to my office personally, and or the division captain patrol, the captain in charge of patrol, Captain Jim Donovan, speaks with that officer, counsels the officer, and makes it and documents the discussion or that interaction with the officer about that particular complaint. And I hope that answers the question. But Lieutenant Perron, I'll give you an opportunity to add from that.
Yeah. So on rare occasions, we have looked into some of these incidents, and again, it's rare that it's the result of an emergency. So I have received complaints in the past. I've seen them. Where we've had officers responding to an emergency, like a serious medical issue. Generally, officers because they're on the street, are the first folks to respond to render medical aid to somebody. So we've had instances like that, and generally, it's just the citizen who filed a complaint didn't know that that's what it was about. But also, frequently we'll have instances where it'll be brought to our attention that an officer was parked in an area that they shouldn't. And obviously that's something that we take seriously. We are no different than the citizens in this community, in a sense that, we have to abide by the laws and the city ordinances, including parking issues. And when those are brought to our attention, the chief and I collaborate with the captain of the respective division, and those officers are counseled about that type of behavior. And usually within one or two of these instances, word gets out within the police department pretty quickly, and officers are conscious of that. So I do encourage the community, if they do see this type of activity, to bring that forward to us.
Thank you, Lieutenant and Chief. The next question what communication standards are in place to make sure people know how and that they can lodge a complaint?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at that. And so the, dialogue like this is actually helpful. I mean, but in addition to that, if one was to turn to the Somerville Police website, there's directions, I believe, on the website of how to file a complaint, whether it be in person, by way of email, or even an anonymous, by anonymous tip. So there is explanation available. And I think, at least from my knowledge, during the last 2 years, correct me if I'm wrong, Director, we have been giving those directions out at various public dialogue sessions. Lieutenant, did I miss anything?
No, that sums it up pretty well.
Yep.
Thank you. And there are no more questions on the floor at the moment.
We moving on?
Yes, Chief.
Okay. So I think I mentioned this earlier. I want the listeners to keep in mind that punishment is punishment, but it's not. Our occupation is just like any other occupation. There's going to be deviations of rules and regulations, and some of them are more severe than others. Obviously, we as police officers are held to a higher standard and under public scrutiny. So, we take that seriously. If there are complaints, we try to handle them accordingly. But in addition to that, if we uncover, as I stated earlier, that there's an allegation against a particular officer that an action was taken or not taken, and we find that there's no actual violation per the written policy of procedure of the department, because that's what we have to go by. If it's in writing and they violate it, we have a violation and it can be sustained. But if it's not in writing, if it's not an actual rule or a regulation that's violated, we also have to be concerned about the officer's rights. And in addition to the officer's rights, the collective bargaining issues that come into play from their union. And so we look at those as policy updates or improvements. If we see that there's a policy failure, we look at that, we revise the policy, and we also look at putting additional training into place during our annual in-service training. Each officer receives a minimum of 40 hours in-service training, which is mandated by the Mass Police Training Council. And so many times, if something comes during the course of a year between trainings, we will have either a roll call training by way of a memo or incorporated into our in-service training that we now have revised, this type of a policy for this reason, and this is what you should be following from this point on.
In terms of collective bargaining, officers are advised of potential violations of department policy, which may subject them to discipline at the commencement of an investigation. We're not always able to identify every potential offense at the outset of an investigation. Sometimes the evidence that's uncovered uncovers additional officer misconduct, and just because they've been advised of certain offenses that we're looking into doesn't make them immune to other issues that may come up. Officers are advised of their rights and responsibilities at the outset of an investigation and before an interview. This is done both verbally and in writing to make sure that they do understand what the rights that they have are. Employees are required to answer all questions asked of them during a professional standards investigation, unless the answer to a question would incriminate them criminally. And then they have to assert their constitutional rights on a question-by-question basis when I do ask them questions during a professional standards interview. Now, what that means is that they can't say no. They can't refuse to answer a question if it wouldn't incriminate them criminally. A negative inference can be drawn if they choose not to answer a question. And even in the event where they do assert a constitutional privilege, to a question, I can draw a negative inference in those cases as well. What that means is by not answering a question.
Lieutenant, you might want to slow down just a bit for the interpreter.
Yeah. I'm a fast talker. I know. I apologize. But what that does mean is when they do refuse to answer a question, it's the equivalent of saying no, of saying that they engage in some type of misconduct.
Lieutenant,
yep.
just to elaborate, I mean, one of the things I just want to bring out on these investigations, there are cases where if there's some type of a conflict of interest, if it's a high-profile incident that's serious in nature, that may be perceived that being investigated from within the department is a conflict of interest. There have been instances where we will approach the appointing authority and make a collective, in the city solicitor's office, and make a collective decision that this type of investigation, based on its severity, is investigated by an outside agency, and we've done that several times, so that there isn't a perception when the findings eventually come out that there was a conflict of interest. But as far as, I'll let you continue on this slide, Lieutenant.
Yep. So an employee is allowed to have union representation with them during an interview. There's established case law that gives them that right. Employees have the right to appeal discipline if it is rendered by the chief, and there are several phases to that process that could include a grievance about potentially too harsh of discipline, and could include bringing it to an independent arbitrator, to the Civil Service Commission. Decisions rendered by an arbitrator in the Civil Service Commission are generally binding, but any officer whose certification could potentially, any officer's certification could be in peril, even if there is a binding decision rendered by an outside body, if they did violate an offense which post has reason to decertify them. If an officer's certification is suspended or revoked, they have a right to a hearing in front of a post commissioner within 15 days of receiving notification of that suspension or revocation.
So the post commission, we've talked a little bit about, and we've explained to you, when it was established, what their role is, what they can, what the scope of authority that they have in certifying and decertifying, how often an officer is certified every 3 years, and what their disciplinary records are forwarded to them into a national database. But I wanted the listeners to realize that the post commissioners themselves are made up of a diverse group of individuals: a judge, social workers, attorneys, union representatives, law enforcement officers, a psychologist, a chaplain, and in activist groups. Their investigators are civilian employees who have the authority to basically decertify a police officer from ever working again in the Commonwealth or anywhere else. And they will decertify an officer regardless of the decision of an arbitrator. Again, as Lieutenant Perrone indicated, those decisions have appeal rights and certain remedies, but thus far in the early years that this post commission has been formed, they still have work ahead of them and are still in a review process for many officers throughout the Commonwealth, whether they should continue to be certified as police officers or decertified going forward.
And just when we talk about far-reaching investigative authority, oftentimes when you hear, talk about civilian review boards, things like that, questions about subpoena powers and the ability to get court documents and things like that often come up. Post does have that far-reaching authority to access that type of information.
I think that concludes the presentation, Director. If anyone has any additional questions or wants us to elaborate on any particular points, we can do that.
Thank you, Chief. So we have come to the end of our session here tonight. We have one final question, and the question is, are these statistics posted publicly?
Lieutenant, I know that you just put these statistics on the chart together this week for this presentation. We can, if they're not already posted on our SPD website, we will post them.
Thank you. So I would like to give a special thanks to the chief and the lieutenant for being here with us tonight and for offering all this great information. I'm sure this is not the last of the webinars that we will be hosting together in order to inform our community members of information that is valuable for all this work that we are doing around public safety for all. And so thank you, Chief Femino, and thank you, Lieutenant Perrone, and to all of our attendees for an informative and engaged conversation. We invite you all to join us in April and May for the upcoming 2 sessions in the Civilian Oversight Webinar Series. You can also access information about civilian oversight, including past webinar recordings, on the Civilian Oversight micro page. We have placed the link on the slide and in the chat for your convenience. We invite you to follow the RSJ department on Facebook and Twitter, and to visit our webpage for more information on the initiatives and everything that is happening around public safety for all. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It has been a lovely evening.